You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 443 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Julian Assange, how he won't be able to get a fair trial, and maybe that fact could be used to help throw his entire case out of court. And more to cover on the Soleimani assassination and the fallout. And I'm going to talk about Donald Trump becoming America's sanctioner-in-chief. All right, everybody, please take the time to share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I'm the news editor there. I write the Daily News Roundup. Both the show and the Daily News Roundup are featured on the homepage. That's libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to somewhere. The show has its own podcast feed and is also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. And last, if you want to become a donor to the show, you do that by going to patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, the first thing I have on Julian Assange is I think we all know that Julian Assange won't get a fair trial. I'm guessing that everybody who listens to my show has probably come to that conclusion. And there's a variety of different reasons. And one of those that I'm not even going to talk about today is just how the guy has been demonized by the U.S. government in the mainstream media and how so many, kind of upper level U.S. officials have, as Hillary Clinton claims, only joked about his assassination, but have talked about just outright killing or executing Julian Assange. But in particular, his treatment right now in the British judicial system is pretty much preventing him from mounting any kind of defense for himself. Part of it is that he's not getting enough medical care. And, from what we have, seen from him in court, that seems to be impacting his mental facility some. I mean, Julian Assange is a bright guy. And so hopefully this is, not permanent damage, but rather, something that's happening because of the traumatic and torturous system that he has found himself in right now. But, that seems like it's, at least for the time being, going to prevent him from mounting any kind of defense. And so, the trial should be put on hold while this guy gets some proper medical care and, should probably be allowed to walk around outside just a little bit, for his overall health. But it's also preventing him from really meeting with his lawyers. And, this is even if, Julian Assange maybe is in a little bit better mental health than he appears when he actually gets to court and is able to work with his legal team, but he's hardly ever able to meet with him. Apparently the computer that they allow him to have access to doesn't really allow him to, look at anything. I'm sure it's a piece of junk that barely works. And just his general inability, to kind of like look at and work on documents, I'm sure, they really limit him. And, people like Chelsea Manning, who's currently in prison, you can't have a whole lot of documents or anything in your cell. And so you can't work a lot on your legal defense. And, this should be a real problem and, again, should cause both the U.S. and the U.K. justice systems to really, have some reflection here on what's going on and at least, again, put a pause to this until the guy's in better health. But, it seems like full steam ahead because Julian Assange is somebody who has embarrassed the intelligence community, the war state, the warmongers, the leadership. Both Bush and Blair were humiliated by their failures of the, Iraq and Afghan wars. And, those failures were exposed in part by the leads of Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. All right. But then there's this other legal defense thing that I read in The Hill by James C. Goodall. And he was apparently a part of Daniel Ellsberg. That's the guy that leaked the Pentagon Papers legal team. And he's saying that look at what happened to Ellsberg and we can make a similar kind of argument in the Julian Assange case. And that is Ellsberg was spied upon. I believe they broke into his psychiatrist's office and tried to, get some, dirt on him that way. And the legal team essentially argued that there's no way for Ellsberg to possibly have a fair trial when the government, has gone this far and done this much. And it seems like a similar situation with Julian Assange, and that's because of the spying that the CIA was doing through a Spanish company on Julian Assange while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. It appears so far that this Spanish newspaper has been breaking most of it, and is around-the-clock surveillance on Assange while he's there. They made modifications of the embassy that would make it easier for people to listen in from outside, I guess using certain technologies. They put listening and spying devices everywhere. And it sounds like this generally amounted to like a live stream of Julian Assange's life, or, how knows how many of the, years he was in this place, which means they have access to all of Julian Assange's privileged conversations with his lawyers. Now, one thing that, this should tell us, and I guess is not necessarily a proof of anything, but the fact that they haven't leaked Julian Assange admitting to either getting the documents from, Russia, the Hillary Clinton emails from Russia, or about him, raping those women, I think it's likely to say that both of those charges now seem untrue to me. Because it seems like if it was true, this guy merely muttering aloud would have produced that kind of evidence. And while it may have been hard to explain how, the CIA, for instance, got that information, I think, just through various leaks that would have got out there, especially the, Russiagate one, because that would have been a link in the Bob Mueller Russiagate narrative, and they desperately needed them to go after Trump. So I don't know, that's not necessarily proof or a case of anything, but just something to consider, how we, have this massive amount of spying and surveillance state, and then they can't turn up any evidence for their claims. And they say that doesn't mean it's not true. And in a way that's true, but man, when you got this much spying capabilities, it seems like you should be able to get something. Anyways, the bigger and more important point here, though, and, the one I want to talk about on the show is just, I think this is a real practical defense for Julian Assange. Now, maybe it doesn't work because the court doesn't care about anything other than nailing Julian Assange to the wall, and they're not going to allow any of this kind of defense strategy, which certainly happened. I mean, it happened to the Plowshare 7, I think Kings Bay 7, these 7 Catholic or some kind of Christian protesters who, peacefully entered into a U.S. base that housed some nuclear armed submarines. And once they were on that base, they, did some nonviolent protests, and apparently were able to walk around for quite some time before they were arrested. And because it's one of those things where when you read the story and you hear all the things they did, you're like, wow, they must have, really done something to do that, but they were just allowed to walk around, and they video evidence of it and everything. And so they weren't allowed to make a lot of the defenses that they wanted to make about their moral objections to nuclear weapons, and why that's, allows them to do these peaceful demonstrations. They're now facing years in prison. And so this could certainly just be thrown out, but it is something that made me a little bit optimistic, especially since it was successfully used in the Ellsberg case. All right, on to the Soleimani assassination and the fallout of it. The Iraqi prime minister told the U.S. that they need to submit a plan on U.S. troop withdrawals from leaving Iraq. Now, almost unbelievably comic, the U.S. says that we're not leaving. And it's just amazing that, you have this government in Iraq that the U.S. put in place, and we say it's important all the time that they're sovereign from Iran, that they need to not have foreign influence. And then when the government stands up and tries to exert its sovereignty, it's the United States of all actors that's saying, we're not going to allow this. We're going to stay. We're going to essentially show the Iraqi people that democracy is meaningless. And just like under Saddam Hussein, it's the, strongest arm that essentially controls things in Iraq. There are some real consequences to just trashing the Iraqi sovereignty. Apparently, they're again looking at purchasing the Russian-made S-300 air defense system. Russia, I guess, responded by saying, well, we'd rather send you S-400 missile defense systems. I'm not sure how far this will progress and if it's something that could actually happen, but it does seem to represent kind of the trend that's we're going to move in Iraq, where Iraq looks to exert its sovereignty by aligning itself with other actors and moving away from the United States. Now, before on the show, I had talked about after the Iraqi government first passed this resolution saying that U.S. troops had to leave, and then the prime minister asked the U.S. for a plan that the U.S. denied. Trump had tweeted that, we would heavily sanction the Iraqi economy if this was the case, because we built things like air bases in their country, which turned out to just be missile targets now thanks to the American presence there, not necessarily helping the Iraqis, I guess, in that way. So the U.S. would be essential, and the Iraqis are saying that would destroy our economy. This is already such a corrupt economy that, people are living in oil-rich cities with only a couple hours of power and without sanitation. It's quite amazing how much they're able to steal from that country and not provide the people with hardly anything. But crippling sanctions from the U.S. could bring back Bill Clinton years, and just imagine, in Trump gets reelected or something, Mike Pompeo or whoever is Secretary of State, Tom Cotton is at the time saying, well, we think, starving the Iraqi children is worth it to remove the Iranian influenced government of Iran. So we get some more news in the past couple of days about the justification for killing Soleimani. It seems to be an actual problem for the Trump administration, and it's really a shame that the Democrats did all their impeachment stuff over this bogus Ukraine gate thing, when right now I think they have a real case to make, and the administration is tripping all over itself on this Iran thing. So first, we have to carry out this attack against Soleimani because he presented an imminent threat to Americans, and the way that sounds to most people is if we had to assassinate somebody who's an imminent threat to us, that means that this guy had a gun, he was on his way to go shoot somebody, or he was on his way to give an order for somebody to shoot somebody. I think it had to be, that direct, and it's quite clear that the Trump administration does not have intelligence saying that. Nobody in the Trump administration has come close to that, and in fact, some people have just come out and flat out said the opposite. Then there was this story about, he was planning more attacks on American embassies, which, is ridiculous because I don't think it was Soleimani necessarily that mastermind what happened at the American embassy on New Year's Eve. But at the same time, it was clearly something the Iraqis were willing to allow too, because it was Iraqi security forces, allowing the, very, very small break-in and, kind of another symbolic like gesture by going in through the back gate of the embassy and, trashing a couple guard shats wasn't, in any serious way, didn't put anybody in danger situation other than the protesters themselves. So, they had this ridiculous thing, but now the State Department would then have to be able to say, oh yeah, we warned, people in these areas and stuff like that. Well, they have nothing to say that happened. So, it seems that that story has completely fallen apart. Attorney General Barr put out a statement saying that Trump absolutely had the authority to carry out this attack. Of course, by the Constitution, that's absolutely not true. There's no declaration of war against Iran or Iraq, really. I mean, the 2002, while they may attempt to use it, doesn't really count. Saddam's been dead for a decade. So yeah, this is, definitely unconstitutional, and he didn't have the authority to do it, but he was able to do it anyways. And so, in some sense, what the president is able to do is just, where the bounds of his authority are. Congress is working on some resolutions that could have some promise to them. There's arguments made the other way about these things being non-binding. I want to optimistically put forward the argument that, these things are Congress exercising its authority under the Constitution to control U.S. foreign policy. Although, as a lot of what I'm reading points out, that the real way Congress could do this may be a little bit easier even than a War Powers Act is just by funding, by saying, no funding to attacking Iran ever. I'm sure it's way too optimistic to think that, Congress will go ahead and impeach Trump over this, but it does, seem to me to be a pretty clear abuse of power. Otherwise, we have Esper disagreeing with Trump on a couple things, including the claim that there's 4 embassies that were being targeted by Soleimani. And then we had this interesting speech by Pompeo. I believe it was at the Hudson Institute, but one of these, right-wing warmongering think tank type places. And Pompeo's talking about the reason for the strike on Soleimani was to establish real deterrence over Iran. Now, I don't know what real deterrence is if it's not nuclear weapons and, the threat of Israel to use their nuclear weapons against Iran. that is real deterrence and what you're trying to deter and everything like that. This is warfare. And it's, just trying to cloak it in deterrence. But I think it does say something very important about the direction that the Trump administration is headed with Pompeo in the role that he's in, and apparently very influential over U.S. foreign policy. Is just this kind of absolute straw man bullying technique that they're going to continue to use, escalate until the other side won't escalate anymore to show that we're the biggest, baddest, and most deadly people around. And that's the way, you get what you want. Unfortunately, it makes Americans less safe. It costs a whole lot of money and kills a whole lot of people. It's completely immoral, right? This is that kind of stupid idea that we could deter any country from acting in its own interest ever. It is essentially the demands that the United States, in a speech by Pompeo, in fact, in May of 2018, to basically give up their national interest. It's just not going to happen. So, if the Trump administration really is adopting that policy, it's a huge mistake. I will say it never seems like Trump is really wed to a particular philosophy. So even though right now we're kind of discussing the possibility that this could be a permanent stay in the Trump administration, if he loses favor with Pompeo, maybe then he could, have influence by somebody else and adopt some other kind of policy. There's a story from after the assassination of Soleimani, but before the Iranian retaliation that I have missed that I thought was worth talking about. And that is the State Department apparently issued memos to all of its envoys saying that they're not to have contact with dissident Iranian groups like the MEK, and they listed 5 other groups in order not to inflame tensions with Iran. So not quite sure why this was sent out, because typically it's, the role of the State Department to work with the dissident groups and, that being some of the justification and propaganda building to bring about ultimately the war from the president. But it may have been the U.S. trying to put out some kind of signal that they were willing to enter a little bit of de-escalation with Iran. I'm not sure. I thought it was a fairly important story and wanted to mention on the show. On the same night that the U.S. tried to kill Soleimani, they also tried to assassinate an Iraqi general, apparently of the Quds Force in Yemen, but that strike failed and killed somebody else, which would also suggest that it wasn't an imminent threat issue. And again, getting back to, kind of where I started this whole thing, I think it's pretty clear that Trump was acting outside of presidential authority here. So, now that we've gotten some more reporting about the Iranian missile response and to the Soleimani assassination, the warning apparently came early enough that the U.S. and Iraqi forces were able to move just about all their military equipment and personnel completely out of harm's way prior to the attack actually coming in, suggesting that this really was, meant to be some kind of symbolic thing from Iran. So as I talked about in the beginning of the last show with Will Porter, the Iranian government has admitted that they downed the Ukrainian flight in the hours after the retaliation missile attack. It's January 8th. Initially, the Iranian government denied this, claiming it was ridiculous that this was a missile attack, but it turns out it actually was the case that the Iranians downed this passenger plane, killing 176 people. There's a good article by Daniel Lazaire on this, just basically breaking down the point how, yes, the Iranians are responsible here. They fired the missile and bear responsibility there. But is the escalation that started, with Trump withdrawing from the JCPOA, but more recently the killing of Soleimani, that resulted in, the situation where Iran would be so paranoid and worried about an American missile response. And, the U.S., Trump was pointing out that they were going to attack Iranian cultural centers. So, the Iranians are probably concerned that their targets could be fired on even in response to a symbolic attack, or a little bit more hasty to push the fire button on that, which, doesn't excuse that mistake. It's not to say that the Iranians aren't responsible, but that this was, one of those predictable outcomes of U.S. escalation in the Middle East. And not to say predictable that this plane would go down or that would be a plane crash, just that civilians are killed in mistakes when you're playing this fast and loose with very explosive weapons. Protests have broken out around as a response to the downing of that jet, It seems to me that these protests are probably legitimate. I understand why the Iranian people would be upset that their government killed a whole bunch of their civilians. I'm not sure, if the U.S. or CIA is trying to fuel any of these protests, the Israelis to exacerbate tensions or hopefully, which won't come to overthrow the Ayatollah. It seems that the Iranian police have started to use tear gas and live ammunition against some of the protesters. So we do have horrific things happening right now, done by the Iranian government. But it's important to remember that all that's turned inward, towards the Iranian people. I guess some Canadians and Ukrainians did die on that plane. But, generally speaking, the Iranian government's, worst oppression is reserved for its own people. And certainly, not directed towards any Americans who are in the immediate region and acting against Iranian influence, because they've shown they're more than willing to work with the American forces when they perceive it as being within Iranian interest. All right, the last story I have on this, I think, is not directly as much related to the Soleimani assassination and more to the downing of the jet, and that is Germany and France and the UK will trigger the mechanism in the JCPOA, claiming that Iran is violating the deal. Now, the problem with this is that the Americans have left the deal. And so it throws, I'm guessing, the deal out of whack, because now you're going to have 3 and 3 on each side rather than the United States being the tiebreaker vote, I guess you could say, but likely siding against Iran. But I've talked about this on the show in the past. The JCPOA clearly lays out that if one of the parties goes and puts sanctions back on Iran, then they would have the ability to start withdrawing from different parts of the deal. They've signaled this all along. They've been very clear with the Europeans. What the problem is that the Iranian economy is struggling. And if the Iranian economy is struggling, there's no reason for them to stay within a deal that they only entered into because, they wanted sanctions relief that they're not getting. So I think that, Iranians, as far as I could tell, are still, within the agreement. Now they don't obeyed by any of the caps and restrictions they put on their program in the agreement, but it's not like they're out making nuclear weapons or taking any steps in that direction. All right, want to talk about some new sanctions. The U.S. sanctioned 7 Venezuelans, including what they call a pro-Maduro member of parliament. The U.S. cut the number of charter flights that will be allowed to Cuba. Trump has been waging an economic war on Cuba throughout his administration. There were reports of attacks on U.S. personnel at the State Department, whatever kind of emissary they had to Cuba, that, the Obama improved relations with that country. Things are moving in the right direction. Then Trump takes office. There's a report of these sound weapons attacks and people having a lot of headaches. It turns out, I think, that crickets were the cause of a lot of this. But anyways, it was exploited by hawks in the Trump administration. Obama's warmed relations with Cuba instantly freeze up, and as a part of this, they're now cutting more flights to Cuba. North Korea talked about the maximum pressure campaign and its failures on the last episode of the show. Robert O'Brien, the new national security advisor, says the U.S. has reached out to North Korea for talks. Thinking to myself, maybe North Korea the Trump administration feeling a little bit more desperate on the horizon of 2020. Picking a fight with Iran isn't the best thing to do. Maybe we'll try to move a little bit closer and have a deal with North Korea to show a foreign policy success for Donald Trump. But the Nets say the U.S. is slapping more sanctions on North Korea. So I'm sure from the North Korean side, they're not necessarily jumping at this as a legitimate change of heart from the Americans that some kind of realistic deal will be proposed. The U.S. has dropped the designation of China as a currency manipulator. This seems like a move in the right direction. Again, I think Trump is probably looking for, foreign policy-ish, and this is a trade, but still a foreign issue. Victory, trying to warm relations now with China. However, the U.S. Army plans to deploy 2 specialized task forces to wage information, electronic, cyber, and missile warfare in the Pacific, and those will be deployed in the next couple of years. Of course, this will, I'm guessing, be directed at, several different places, North Korea, Russia, but China being the main target of this. And so it's just interesting that while, sometimes the Trump administration seems like, oh, hey, they're trying to warm relations, there's always these other hawkish things going on that I'm sure to all the other countries are signals that the U.S. doesn't actually want to change the relationship. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show today. There's a Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, at KYAAALE on Twitter. Find everything I do, articles, blog posts, Foreign Policy Focus episodes, daily news roundup, everything's at the Libertarian Institute. Check out antiwar.com. And if you want to donate to me, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.